Hello, in this lecture we're going to talk about economic institutions, chapter 3. We're going to start off with a quote from Friedrich Hayek, another economist, and he says that nobody can be a great economist who is only an economist, and I am even tempted to add that economist who is only an economist is likely to be a nuisance, if not a positive danger. And I'm not going to pretend to know everything that was in mind during that quote, but I think part of what is being said here is that economics is going to be somewhat of a specialty. And of course, what we're doing is looking at things scientifically. So we're going to look at human behavior in a scientific way. In doing that, we're basically specializing, we're drilling down on one particular thing. And there's a danger whenever we do that. And I think this is a danger in a lot of different fields, not just within economics, that we get one viewpoint, and if we don't then apply that viewpoint into the larger context, into other types of disciplines, and thinking through things in terms of a larger context, we could come to conclusions that may not be good and may be actually somewhat destructive. So there are good things about, of course, there's too much information in the world for us to be specialists in everything. And it is very useful to us to take things and drill down on them and specialize in them and apply a scientific method to them. And it's also beneficial, however, to have some broader sense of the wider picture and apply these things into the wider picture when we're applying them practically and making decisions on them. So that might be part of what we're going for in a quote such as this. Now we'll take a look at the chapter goals, which will be to define market economy and compare and contrast socialism with capitalism, describe the role of businesses and households in a market economy, list and discuss the various roles of government, explain why global policy issues differ from national policy issues. All right, so first we're going to take a look at the economic systems, kind of at a broad, very, very broad look at this. We're going to say that the U.S. is a market economy system, which is an economic system based on private property and market in which, in principle, individuals decide how, what, and for whom to produce. So think about those questions. We want to think about the question of who decides how, what, and for whom we're going to produce. And remember what we're saying here is that there's different means of production to make the production, and we have different ideas on the distribution. How are we going to distribute? And the question is, who gets to decide these things? And if we look at the spectrum on who decides these types of things, it's really kind of a spectrum. And over here, we've got communism versus basically capitalism or markets, let's say. And we're saying that basically the U.S. is over here on the market side. Now, I want to point out that that's a complete oversimplification, because clearly there are aspects where the market where we either regulate the market or where the government does do certain things, and we'll talk about why that is the case at a later point. There are some cases where we think that some types of industries are natural monopolies, and there are some instances in which we're thinking either high regulation and or government actually doing the activity could be good, even if we have an ideal of markets. However, it's also thought that in the U.S., if and when markets are most applicable, that is the preferred way to go. That could lead to the most efficiency. On the other side of the spectrum, we have communism and socialism being over towards this end of the spectrum. And again, no country is generally basically completely communist in that they don't apply any market factors. I think most people in most countries, even if they're run by dictatorially, that will still come up to the conclusion that applying some market forces in some ways can yield results if applied effectively. So we'll talk about the difference between those two. And if we're saying that individuals are the ones that make these decisions, note that what we're saying is that the people make the decisions. How are they going to make those decisions? They make those decisions based on self-interest in a market system, and they make those systems in a broader sense through the invisible hand. Through the invisible hand, rather than a committee in a communist society or just one individual trying to say what we will produce and for whom we're going to produce and how we're going to produce it, rather than a centralized government doing that, whether it be a committee or an individual doing that. The idea of a market is that through the market, through individuals' self-interest, that's what's going to drive it. So we're going to talk a bit about the pros and cons of that, of these two systems. So markets work through a system of rewards and payments. So the idea of an invisible hand, the Adam Smith idea of an invisible hand, does work through self-interest, meaning that when you go to the store, you expect some degree of customer service and you expect the prices to be reasonable, and the store, is going to make prices reasonable and whatnot. And the reason that happens, though, is not because the store is necessarily interested in our well-being. They're interested in their well-being, but through both of us looking at our general well-being, not that we tend to want to hurt the other end. Obviously, we want to have an honest exchange, and through that mutual self-interest within a market setting, within the rules of a market setting, generally comes to create a system that can determine who's going to produce for what and who's going to receive the benefits of the production. So that's going to be basically the idea of that invisible hand idea. So individuals are free to do whatever they want as long as it is legal. So notice what we're thinking about when we think about what is legal. Everybody's got their natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, generally property being natural rights for individuals. And as long as individuals, for the most part, are not breaking the law, and in essence, the basis of the law not violating someone else's rights, then people can act in their self-interest or in however way they please. The idea being that they're probably going to act somewhat in their self-interest, and in so doing, that's what basically will create, market forces, and those market forces are what drives these questions. What are we going to produce? How are we going to produce it? For whom are we going to produce? So fluctuations in prices play a central role in coordinating individuals' wants in the market. So notice what has to happen if we were going to have trade, if we're going to have a market, if we're going to have two people getting together and doing business transactions, and in so doing, answering these questions in a market format. Who's going to produce? How are we going to produce it? For whom are we going to produce it? Well, in order to do that, we need basically fairly honest, we need open information. We need the markets to be fairly open. We need people to communicate, and we need people to be able to change and fluctuate prices in order to change with conditions in the market. And note that that's one of the big problems with this idea of a communist or socialist society, is that the prices are really sticky and hard to fluctuate. If we have a central committee that is trying to figure out prices for an entire economy, I mean, you can think about how, if we're a central committee in Washington trying to see how much, someone in Iowa should sell their corn for or something like that, that's not an easy thing to do. That's why it's thought of that as, of course, an economy grows, you almost have to have market forces to some degree, you would think, in order to have that fluctuation to make those types of decisions on their own when market forces are applicable. So most economists believe that market is a good way to coordinate economic activity. So when markets can be used, they should most likely be applied. Most economists would come to that conclusion. They'd say, well, there are many conditions in where market forces can apply, and even in the conditions where market forces have problems, and we'll talk about that, they have inherent problems in certain places. Our goal is probably to try to find a way to apply as much of market forces or make markets work as well as possible, because of the benefits of markets generally being more efficient in deciding these questions. What are we going to produce? For whom are we going to produce? And who are we going to produce for? So capitalism versus socialism. So capitalism is an economic system based on market in which the ownership and the means of production reside in individuals. So remember, what we're talking about is our spectrum. Socialism is going to be over here closer to kind of communism, and we've got markets over here being the capitalism. And notice that economic system based on a market. So remember that the paradox here, of course, being that the individuals within a market are going to decide what to produce, and they do that somewhat through self-interest, as we've been discussing. And that historically has been, it's hard to wrap your head around that, because it doesn't seem that a system based on somebody doing what's best for themselves can be a system in which most people as a whole are better off. It seems to be the case many times, because it does seem that production has gone up, but that's been something that's been tough for people to kind of wrap your head around. If you think about a socialist economy, then is an economic system based on individual and goodwill towards others, not on their self-interest, and in which in principle society decides what. So society decides what, how, and for whom to produce. So remember, those are our key questions, and that has to do with kind of control, right? Who gets to decide what to produce, how to produce it, for whom to produce. And under a socialist system, we're saying some type of centralized government is going to do that. Some type of centralized government's going to get together and say, we are going to produce this many things. If you talk about in a communist society, if you talked about, Russia, who had the means of production, well, they tried to centrally plan, producing everything. Like, we're going to produce this many, hey, Nike, we're going to produce this many shoes, and they're going to try to centrally plan that. And you could see how complex that can be. But you could see the goal of that too, if it was applied, even if it's applied in its most goodwill format, that there could be goodwill in that they're trying to decide exactly what to produce and thereby optimize the production and then distribute it and the idea of need. And notice the market economy is basically saying that the market's going to do that. Who decides how and for whom and what are we going to produce? Well, people in the market decide it. We're going to say, you know what, no committee's going to decide. We're not going to tell Nike how many shoes they make. They make how many shoes they're going to make based on basically the self-interest of Nike. And the people who buy the shoes are going to buy however many shoes they want to buy based on the self-interest of the individual who wants to buy the shoe. And if there's a disconnect between those two individuals, something's going to happen. And if Nike is not selling their shoes, they're going to reduce the price, or they're not going to make any money. They're going to go out of business. And so that's going to be the contrast between these two types of ideas. So in socialism is where all people contribute to what they can and get what they need. So that's kind of like an ideal nature of the world, right? If we could in some way just contribute what we can, if we could just all somehow do what we do best and contribute that to the pot, that would be nice. And then it's based on the government ownership. So who owns the stuff? The government. So whatever we produce is basically going to be put into the pot. And once it gets put into the pot, that means that there's going to have to be some centralized form of distribution, which again could be somewhat disturbing, because the idea here is that the government that now has control over all the goods will have good intentions, and they very well, could means of production, activity, government, and the centralized planning, in order to then do the next step, which is to distribute that stuff. So it's based on the government ownership of the means of production, with economic activity governed by central planning. So the central plan is going to be what happens there. So China and Venezuela are often identified as socialists in the news. And again, I mean, if we think about China here, we could say they're socialists or communists, but also note that they're still again going to apply some market strategies. So there's a lot of instances where China has applied some market strategies and seen some growth within that. So just to point out some of the topics that will come up between the idea of capitalism versus socialism. Many people will make the argument that capitalism is more efficient, meaning it tends to produce more stuff. If we can have competition and we use the invisible hand of the market, we tend to produce more things, which is good because we can consume more things. One of the arguments that we have when we have just free capitalism and no checks on it could be that we see a higher distribution problem, meaning the question of who gets to consume. When we think about what are we going to make, how much are we going to make, we tend to make more. That's good. But on the distribution side, we see more of a skew towards distribution, where less people could get more of the stuff. And so on a capitalism, on free capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, the argument will be that the distribution of this stuff that gets produced gets unevenly distributed. That's going to be, of course, the argument on the socialism side when we talk about central planning and whatnot. The argument, again, the problem with it tends to be oftentimes that we don't produce as much stuff, and there's kind of a danger in that when you do have a central planner, then of course all the stuff is being distributed by a central plan, which means that all the stuff is in one area, which is kind of gives a lot of control to a small group of people. But of course, if those group of people were somehow ideally focused, the idea is that maybe they can be better at the distribution in some way, and at least not end up in a position where we have people that are very, very poor, very well off, that we have inhumane issues. That the distribution should be such that if we had good distribution, that we won't have extreme poverty and things like that. So and again, most countries are kind of in the middle. So the question really doesn't seem to be, should we be communist or should we be market oriented? It seems to be, there's got to be some type of combination based on different types of things in the market, and it could change based on the countries too, because larger companies' economic needs are different than smaller companies. We see that even countries' economic needs, and we see that even with companies too. Obviously, when companies get larger, you have to decentralize some of the decision making to others. Maybe the same is true with countries as well. If you got a very large country, then maybe markets are necessary in certain factors, and those are areas that are currently under debate.